Welcome to our Thursday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing to teach on how you can be full of God. It's not up to God, it's up to you. You can be as full of God as you want to be. Most people know that there's more from God than what they're experiencing, but they don't feel like that they can do much about it. They just pray and wait on God to touch them and to do things. I'm sharing things with you that have just revolutionized my life. And there's multiple benefits of this, but another benefit that I really want to emphasize is that if God has touched you in the past, and it doesn't seem like it's impacting you the way now that it did then, well then it's you that caused that to happen. I know some people think, well, this isn't blessing me, but it should bless you to find out that it's not God that has an expiration date on His blessings. If God has ever given you anything, it says in Romans 11:29, the gifts and the callings of God are without repentance. God has never taken it back. If God has ever healed you, that healing is still there. If you've ever had joy, that joy is still there. If you've ever had peace, it's still there. God has never turned off the tap. He has never quit flowing towards you. It's us that does these things many times without even recognizing what we're doing and finding out that I'm the one who stopped this. Well, it's a blessing because then you can reverse this process and you can cause the joy, the blessing, the victory, the healing, the peace, deliverance, whatever, to just flow through you. It's really at your control. It's at your, it's responsible to you. You know, some people think, so you can just turn God on and off. No, God's on all of the time. It's me that's on and off. And whenever I find the switch and learn how to flip the switch and turn myself on, I can see God flow right out of me. You know, we just recently had a service, and during the praise and worship service, Daniel Amstutz, who's the guy that leads the praise and worship at our Charis Bible College, he just called on Paul Milligan, who was sitting next to me. Paul Milligan is our COO of our ministry. He's the one that runs our business school and stuff. He's a businessman. And Daniel just called on him and said, Paul, I believe that God's got a word through you. And when he said that, I looked over at Paul and Paul looked at me, and this expression on his face said it all, like, I haven't got a thing. But Paul's been around a long time, and he's seen awesome, awesome miracles happen in his life. And he knew that the Holy Spirit on the inside of him is always on. It's not the Holy Spirit that you have to wait on to come upon you. He's always ready to go, revved up and ready to go. It's us that's on and off. And because of that, Paul just walked up on that stage, grabbed a microphone, started praying, gifts of the Spirit flowed. I don't even know, 50 to 100 people came forward. We saw miracles happen and all kinds of things happen. And in a sense, some people will say, so you can just turn the gifts of the Spirit on whenever you want to. No, the gifts of the Spirit are always on. But you can be turned on and off. And so I say all of this because there's some people that when I say that you can be as full of God as you want to, that's putting responsibility on you that many people don't want to have. And they want to say, oh no, it's just up to God whether He touches me and I'm waiting on God. No, God's waiting on you. God is ready to go. And you don't have to wait on God. God is waiting on you, and you need to stir yourself up or you're going to sink to the bottom. And so anyway, I say all of these things to say that I've been teaching on how you can stay full of God. You have to glorify God. This is based on Romans chapter 1, verse 21, where it says that they glorified not God. This is talking about people who walked away from God and stopped God's power and stopped the flow of His Spirit in their life. The way they did is they didn't glorify Him, which that means they didn't honor Him, they didn't focus on Him, they didn't magnify Him, value Him the way that they should. The second thing was they quit being thankful, which these things are interrelated. They're dependent upon each other. If you aren't really glorifying God, you will not be thankful. So if you're an unthankful person, I can guarantee you, you aren't placing the value on God that you should. Amen. And I know that there's some people watching this program right now say, but you don't know what I'm going through. Well, then you don't know what Jesus has done for you, or you aren't focused on it. Because I don't care what you're going through, Whatever you're going through, God, what He's done for you is infinitely greater than whatever your problem is. Even if you were to die, if you've got a terminal disease and you're wasting away, Jesus has done so much for you that if you were to die and you never saw your healing manifest in this life, you would instantly go into heaven. And you would be perfect and you would be whole and there'll be no more sickness, no more crying, no more tears. And if you were really glorifying God and focused on what He's done instead of focused on your problem, you could be rejoicing and praising God even in the midst of a bad situation. And I know some of you think, well, man, that's different than what I've heard. Obviously. Let me turn over here and just share this with you. Paul said these exact same things. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and in verse 17, he says, "For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Now some people just read through this and it doesn't mean anything to them, but think about this. Paul said, our light affliction. And some people think, well, that's the problem. I got a heavy affliction. Nobody knows the trouble I feel. Nobody knows my sorrow. We write songs about that. We glory in how bad our situation is. And we think, well, Paul, he just had a light affliction. I got this heavy, heavy burden. You know, I'm not going to take time, but if you were to turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, you could read about Paul's light afflictions, being put in prison, being beaten with rods, being beaten with whips, being shipwrecked, being hated of all men, run out of town, stoned to death and raised from the dead, and on you could go. Paul had more problems than what you've got, and I dare to say that over any person watching this program right now. Wherever you are, regardless of how bad it is, Paul's problems were worse, and yet he said it's just a light affliction. So if Paul had bigger problems than you do, and yet he says it's a light affliction, then tell me how you can justify talking about how heavy your burden is. Now don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to say that you don't have problems. I'm not saying that we don't have critical, terrible situations that we're in, but compared to other things, it's just a light affliction. And see, that's what Paul did. Paul made a comparison here that shrunk his problem down to nothing. And here's what he said, our light affliction, which is but for a moment. Now, we don't know exactly how long Paul ministered, but I suspect that it was a minimum of 20 years, could have been 30 or 40 years worth of ministry, and he was persecuted and had all of these things happen. And somebody says, well, that's a long time, not compared to eternity. Did you know that if you live for 70, 80, 100 years, compared to eternity, that's less than the snap of a finger. That's nothing. And see, if you would look at your problems and evaluate it in the light of eternity, that just shrinks it down to where it's not that big of a deal. I've said this on previous programs, but if you're dealing with the frustrations of traffic, if you're dealing with, not having enough money to do something, if you're dealing with people being laid off at work, or on and on you could go with things that in themselves, they may be a problem, but if you stack it up against eternity, 1,000,000 years from now, once you're in eternity, are you going to remember the thing that is making you so upset today? And if it doesn't affect eternity, then it's not a big deal. It's just a light affliction. And I know some of you think, well, that's not true. That's because you don't have an eternal mindset. I've given this testimony before, but to me, it's a classic story in my experience. But I was speaking at this partner of mine in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he has a business, and he would call his employees in and say, the clock's running, you listen to this man talk as long as you want to. And so I spoke, and anyway, we saw some great things happen. After I spoke, I went into the break room, people came back, and a number of them got born again, and some great things happened. There was this one woman who came back, and she had tried to commit suicide the day before. She had slit her wrist, and they put her in the hospital. This was her first day back at work. And she was telling me about how bad her problems was. And the biggest thing, she had been through either 3 or 4 divorces. I'm not sure the exact number. But it was something like that, 3 or 4 divorces, and the man that she was married to at that time had just told her he was going to divorce her, and she just couldn't take another divorce, and that's the reason she tried to commit suicide. And she was saying, would you please pray for my marriage? Would you please pray? I just can't stand it if I get another divorce. And this woman had already told me that she wasn't a Christian. She says, I'm not a Christian like you and the owner of this business, but I know that prayers work. Would you please pray for me? So you know what I did? I just stopped her and I said, now wait a minute. You know that you aren't a Christian. And she said, yes. And I said, if you were to die right now, you would go to hell instead of to heaven. And she says, that's right. And I said, and you don't want me to pray for your salvation. You want me to pray for your marriage and not pray for your salvation. And she said, yes. And I said, lady, don't you realize that after you've been in hell for 1,000 years, you won't give a rip whether this marriage worked out or not? I said, you need to set some priorities. You need to get saved. You need to get right with God. And it's just like I slapped her. She just I quit crying. All of a sudden, she saw things from a different perspective, and she says, you're right. I need to get saved. So I prayed with her for salvation. And then I prayed with her about her marriage. I'm not saying that marriage isn't important, but I am again saying that, see, you have to establish everything in the light of eternity. And if you look at things properly, then even if you're going through a divorce, you could still be thankful and say, Father, thank you that you've engraven me upon the palms of your hands, is what the Bible says, that you will never leave me nor forsake me. You'll never divorce me. Thank you. And you could be thankful. You could actually discover God and His faithfulness in a way that you never knew when your marriage was working good. Did you know when you lose somebody, you can actually turn to God, and even though it's a tragic situation to have the death of a person that you've been married to for decades, it can actually work out to be a good thing. Not that God caused it, but you're turning to God. You can find things to be thankful for. You can find God's supply in that situation. I've got a friend of mine that he and his wife have been friends of mine for over 30 years, and his wife died. I was there just an hour or two before she died, and he loved her. They were married for over 50 years. And I understand him missing her. But did you know it got so bad that he told me that he literally felt like he was just not going to live. And out of desperation, he turned to the Lord, and God met him. And he has found a newfound relationship with God. God is so real to him. He is giving him so much joy that he actually told me that he is happier now after his wife has died than he's ever been in his life. And he can't share that with most people because most people are only evaluating things, see, from a human standpoint, and they're thinking that somehow or another he's saying that he didn't love his wife or that it's better without his wife. That's not what he's saying at all, but he turned to the Lord and has found the supply and the reality of God in his life to be greater than it's ever been, and because of it, he's happier than he's ever been. And so he can rejoice and he can be thankful even in the midst of a bad situation. I'm saying all of these things because there's people watching this program right now that you're saying, oh yeah, I would rejoice if everything was good, but if you have a bad situation, you feel justified in being a griper and a complainer. And I'm trying to take that away from you by using these examples of people that have lost their mate. And Paul right here, who had suffered more persecution, more heartache, more problems than you and I have ever suffered, and yet he says it's just a light affliction. If Paul could say that, you could say it. And one of the ways you do it is to say it's only for a moment. In light of eternity, this thing's not going to be a big deal. You know, I keep a journal, and I've kept it since 1996, I believe. And I go back and I read some of my journal, and some of the things that were a problem to me on that day that I could tell by the way I was writing, this was really a problem. I look back, and if I hadn't have written it down in my journal, I wouldn't have even remembered that it ever happened. In the scheme of things, 15, 20 years later, it is no big deal. And I'm telling you, brothers and sisters, many of us are just focused and magnifying the problem. One of the things that will break that is to start glorifying God and magnifying God and remembering, being thankful for what He's done and going back and focusing upon the good things. See, thanksgiving makes you focus on the good things. If you were just to make a decision and say, I am going to thank God today, I am going to be a thankful person. I'm not going to be a griper or a complainer, but today I'm going to thank God. And if you were to force yourself to do that, and if you followed through and fulfilled it, it would make you become positive. You can't thank God focused on all of your problems. Let's say that the doctor's giving you a death sentence and you're going to die. And most people tend to just focus on that and think about the negatives and plan their funeral and write their eulogy and all of these kind of things. But if you were to say, no, I'm going to be thankful, then you know what? And if you had this death sentence on you, but you said, I am going to be thankful, then it would make you either look back at God and how He's healed other people, how He's healed you in the past, and it would give you new encouragement and strength for the present. Or if you couldn't even see your way to be healed, it would make you look beyond your problem and focus on heaven and say that someday all this is going to be over. If the worst thing happens to me, I'm going to die and go to be with Jesus. And it would cause you to rejoice and it would build up your faith. Colossians 2:7, you would abound in faith with thanksgiving. So it would either draw strength from the past, it would draw joy and peace about the future. It would take care of the discouragement and the fear and the doubt that you've got. I'm telling you, this is the way it's supposed to be. But sad to say, most people magnify their problems. They magnify what the doctor said. They magnify the hurt, the pain. They magnify all of these negative things. And even though I don't deny that negative things exist, I'm not going to magnify them. I'm going to glorify and magnify God, and I'm going to do that with thanksgiving. I magnify God with thanksgiving. Psalms chapter 69, verse 30. And I'm going to start talking about how good God is. And if worse comes to worse, I'm going to go to be with Jesus. You know, we sing this song, when we all get to heaven, what a day that will be. And everybody, oh yes, brother. And then the doctor tells you you're going there, and you start crying and fall apart like a $2 suitcase. Something's wrong with that picture. It's just, you know, it's hypocritical. It's just religious, much of what we say. The reality of it comes down to what's going on in your life today. I don't care if it's good, bad, or indifferent. I don't care what's going on. If you are truly glorifying God and valuing Him and prizing what He has done and the promises He's made for the future, then you should be thankful and you should be rejoicing. If you aren't rejoicing and if you aren't thankful, you can't use your problems as an excuse. It's just the fact that you are not glorifying God and not thinking about His goodness. See again, Paul says our light affliction. Paul had more problems and yet it was just a small deal. Not because his problems were smaller, but because he diminished them. He shrunk them. He disesteemed. He despised these things. If you remember all the way back to my teaching last week, I was talking about in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, it says that Jesus, for the joy that was set before Him, despised the shame. The word despise there is the exact opposite of the word glorify in Romans 1:21, where it says we have to glorify God. Jesus despised, disesteemed the suffering. And you can do that. Paul disesteemed his suffering. And how did he do it? He put it into context and realized that in the context of eternity, the things he was suffering was no big deal. That the reward that God was going to give him was infinitely greater than the suffering that he was facing. Man, that's awesome. You know, Paul is also the one that wrote in Romans chapter 8. He says, I reckon that the sufferings of this present world are not even worthy to be compared to the glory which shall be revealed in us. Boy, now see, that's a big thing. And that's what he's saying right here. It's just a light affliction. It's just for a moment. How could he say that? Because he saw that in eternity, Paul was going to be so compensated for anything he suffered in this life that it wasn't even worthy to be mentioned. It's not even worthy to be compared Some of you right now are suffering through bad things, and compared to me, compared to somebody else, it may be really, really bad. But compared to what God has done for you and the promises that He has for you in heaven, it is not even worthy to mention. If you had the right attitude and you're going through terrible things right now, you could be just rejoicing and praising God and thanking God for all the good things that He's doing. I know some of you are thinking, man, you're weird. Well, I think you're weird. I think that this is the normal Christian life. So Paul said it's just a light affliction, which is but for a moment, and it works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. In verse 18, he says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, or temporary, but the things which are not seen are eternal. Paul said, I'm not looking just in this physical world. I'm looking in the spiritual world. And I'm looking in eternity. And he's seeing things by faith. Did you know if you were in a crisis situation right now, whatever your need is, God has already supplied it. The supply is already there. It's in the spiritual realm. Now, it doesn't need to stay there. It needs to come into the physical realm, and that happens through your soul. Man, I could take that statement I made right there and spend weeks and weeks and weeks teaching on that. But God has already made the supply. And if you could get to where you walk by faith instead of by sight, if you could get to where you see things that you can't see with your physical eyes, but you could see them with your heart, that's what the Bible calls faith. If you were operating in faith, I guarantee you, you could rejoice. I don't care what your circumstances are. And I know people are thinking, well, you're saying all these things, but you can't live this. You know, I had my son die, and I was told that he was dead. He had been dead for over 4 hours when I was called, and by the time we got in there, it had been nearly 5 hours. And you know what? In the natural, I had a problem. In the natural, there was reason to be brokenhearted and gripe and complain. And yet I chose to do what this said and put it into the light of eternity. I knew that even if my son remained dead, he wouldn't stay dead forever. There is a resurrection. I also knew that there was things going on that I couldn't see with my physical eyes. I believed in the power of God. I believed in the spirit realm. And anyway, it's a long story, but because of that, I chose to go by faith instead of by my feelings. I rejected my feelings of hurt and pain and fear and grief, and I spoke faith, and my son, who had been dead for nearly 5 hours, was raised from the dead. He was in a morgue, stripped naked, on a cooler with the toe tag on, and he sat up and started talking. And that was in 2001. Today he is perfectly healthy, no brain damage, no more than he had before, praise God. And I tell you, God is a good God. And I'm saying that you can take your situations and somebody says, well, that's not fair. You aren't understanding what I'm going through. I'm not denying that you've got problems, but I'm saying you don't understand what this is saying. You can look beyond your problem and you can rejoice and be thankful regardless of what's going on.
Spreekt het onderwijs van Andrew Wommack je aan en wil je je hierin verder verdiepen? Dan is Charis Bible College dé plek voor jou. Charis Bible College is de internationale bijbelschool van Andrew Wommack Ministries met vestigingen in verschillende landen, waaronder ook Nederland. Ontdek wie je werkelijk bent en welk plan God heeft met jouw leven. Kies de vorm van onderwijs die het beste bij jou past en begin aan een geweldige reis samen met God bij Charis Bible College.